Welcome to the first I&I Roundtable. We're here in June of 2023, and we've got some of our integral nation directors here, and we're just going to be talking about the topical issues of the day, things that concern us and that we've been thinking about and writing about and making videos about. So welcome to the first I&I Roundtable. If you're collecting them, this one will be a collector's item. So I'd like to get started. Our first topic is going to be something that's in the news a lot. China, the rise of China, confrontation with the United States. Over the past couple years, we've seen a ratchet of increasing tensions between our country and the People's Republic of China. Recently, that is to say, beginning in September of 2021, President Biden appeared to go off script in an interview when he was asked if the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan if it were attacked. And he responded that we would. The White House quickly tried to walk back his remarks, but in May of 2022, he again said that the United States will defend Taiwan if attacked. This is a variation from the US's traditional position of strategic ambiguity. That is to say, keeping the options open to dissuade attack and other diplomatic means. So I guess we'd like to get started. Guhan, what do you think about our newfound commitment to defend Taiwan against China?
Well, it's really come down to a series of desperate measures because Taiwan possesses, despite what its position would imply, it does possess a lot of advantages towards the U.S., both in terms of economics and geopolitics. The biggest economic factor, as everyone knows, is they're the biggest supplier of microchips in the world, alongside the Netherlands. Any damage to Taiwan would severely harm any kind of computer industry. And as you know, because as automation expands across multiple industries, particularly with the new fourth industrial revolution, computers are more important than ever. One single crippling, and our entire economy, and in some countries' cases, societies could collapse.
So
But
your position is that because Taiwan is so important in the microchip supply chain, it just makes economic sense to guarantee their independence.
yes, that's the first one. The next one, of course, is geopolitics. Now, as we know, as of right now, China is in no position to launch any attacks on U.S. territory, or at least any mainland U.S. territory. The only one that's really under threat is Guam. Well, that's because they're contained by a series of U.S. allies to their coastline. They'll get Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and to a lesser extent, Indonesia and India. The Chinese Navy can't really expand outwards because if they did try, the U.S. military or Japanese Navy could just sink their ships. But should the Chinese take Taiwan, they'll be able to break that encirclement defense we've built around them, and their Navy could expand into Pacific waters and challenge us directly. Even then, the actual naval expansion of theirs, they claim, at least if you go by their claims, they'll reach naval parity with the U.S. by 2049. Where that's actually possible, we'll have to wait and see. But from a strategic perspective, I guess our generals want to be more safe than sorry.
So let's go to you, Burton. The U.S. Navy sailing through the Straits of Taiwan, aircraft carriers, missiles potentially being positioned nearby the island. How do you feel about this?
Well, obviously, it's very confrontational. It's an obvious provocation, and one really that I think is unnecessary because this conversation has already turned directly towards military conflict and confrontation. We need to realize that there is a strata above that that overlays all of those conversations and concerns. And what overlays it all is the fact that at its core, this is a trade war. And this trade war really, well, it's been going on for decades, but this didn't start under Biden. Biden is just the person who is most willing to, lube the deal of the military industrial complex. This really started in earnest under Trump. Trump is the one who, granted, in his position and in the position that we're in this trade imbalance with China, he did the one thing that the U.S. government can do, which was to enact the tariffs.
So when you say it's a trade war, the fact, like Guhan said, that we are so dependent on Taiwan for our chip supply chain, does that mean we basically been losing that trade war? And if so, what do we need to do to fix that?
Well, I mean, it's a total imbalance of our priorities, of our national priorities. And that's nothing new. I mean, this has been set in motion since 1944 with Bretton Woods. You know, we could make anything here, but the fact of the matter is we've shipped everything overseas. We don't make anything here anymore. So the fact that we put all of our eggs in one basket, that's something that you never do. That's something
So,
that you don't do in investing. It's just a no-no.
so
So that
what I'm hearing is by spreading our economic reach out and becoming interdependent, it paradoxically makes us more at risk to go to war than if we had more autarky here in the United States. I'm going to go to Jesse. Jesse, what do you think? Escalating tensions. China's a big country. They're building a navy. They have nuclear weapons. But at the same time, the US Navy has no peer around the world. But a lot of people are questioning whether it's wise to give an explicit commitment.
Yeah, well, the US does not have a peer currently. Supposedly by 2035, the Chinese are probably going to be on par with us, if not near us. They're definitely going to be our peer. Maybe not as powerful as us, but we have commitments all around the world. Basically, I don't think war is inevitable. I don't think it should be looked at that. I think that since it's a huge country with the biggest population in the world with nuclear weapons, I think they may need some space. First of all, we shouldn't have gave them all of our industry. It's out of pure greed. We wanted to utilize their cheap foreign labor. And now, is there a way back? That's a real question.
And we saw when Biden came into office, I think the first meeting between Secretary Blinken and the Chinese, he hectored them about human rights. And we've seen an increasingly confrontational tone. You're saying that that's not necessary, that it's.
Of course, they're communists. It's a terrible form of government, and they probably treat a lot of people really bad. I'm not denying that at all. I'm saying that because of what they're doing doesn't mean that we should risk a nuclear war or something that could destroy both of our navies. You know, we could have thousands of missiles raining down on our military bases in the Pacific, you know, and it's going to destroy global trade. We're so interdependent on each other that if this happens, it's going to hurt everybody.
Well, let me get back around to that same question, and I'll go back around, and it ties into what all three of you were saying. Sorry, guys. We're gonna have to edit that part out. The boys beating on the door.
yeah,
You guys
Anthony
can't.
Go, please.
Could you guys hear my kids jumping?
No, actually, we didn't hear.
That's good.
No,
All right. We can cut this out, right?
Yeah, just
Okay.
send it. We're gonna have to send it to Anthony, and he'll edit it and make
Okay.
it nice.
He'll do
How
the
are
intro
you
too.
reco-
All
Are
right,
you
going back.
recording it? Oh, go.
Yeah, it's all being recorded. He'll just have to clip it. So that ties back into what you three have been saying, and something I wanted to touch on, which is aggression in the South China Sea. We've seen China claim territorial waters extending all the way up to the Philippines. Their Navy has gotten to be in excess of 300 ships. Now, these aren't blue water ships for the most part, and they can't venture very far from China. But like Jesse was saying, the Chinese are quite frightened of being boxed in. And to what extent should we be concerned about their aggression in the South China Sea, or are they right to worry?
personally.
Oh no, you can go, Burton. It's fine.
If I could just go ahead, the I don't think that we have a ton to worry about. There are, first of all, again, this goes back to trade. They want to control trade routes through the Pacific. To a certain extent, and going back to the Taiwan issue, for many, many years, we recognized a one China policy. Technically, we still do, but they have legitimate trade and national security concerns. They are not a naval power. They are a land power. The same as Russia. They're a land-based, for the most part, they're a land-based power. So
Let me
they have a
let me
formidable.
ask let me ask Guhan this. China imports a huge amount of energy and food. Like Brandon was saying, they're not a naval power. The prospect of that getting choked off has got to be pretty scary to them. Do you think they're right to worry about that?
Yeah, they are certainly right. There's one strait that always comes up in these conversations when it comes to China's vulnerability, the Strait of Malacca. It's a sea route that goes through Indonesia. Vast majority of their food and energy imports from like Iran and other African countries go through this strait. Any decently sized navy, it doesn't even have to be the U.S. or even India. Just Indonesia alone could easily blockade this strait, and China would be completely cut off from its major food and energy. They have tried to replace this by building stronger economic ties with Russia, but it's simply the sheer efficiency of ships can't be beaten, no matter how many
Right.
pipelines or railroads they built. And as for China being a naval threat, like I said, by their own estimates, 2049 is when they'll be naval parity, which is like 26 years from now. And even that's what they say. We don't know if it's going to actually take that long. As of right now, they aren't really a major threat to us. If for
Right.
to just purely for our own security concerns, we're better off just like what Burns said before, carrying on our current policy of strategic ambiguity and building closer ties with the local powers. And Biden is doing that, but not really in the proper direction. When he builds these connections with Southeast Asian countries, he seems to be prioritizing more spreading of liberal values than actually building a close relationship. He's constantly putting different quotas like human rights conversations or trying to promote these liberal values in these countries, even though they reject them. It's only
Well,
this year.
let's transition to that because China's not a naval power; they are an industrial power. We have other industrial powers in the Pacific, Japan and South Korea, particularly, but perhaps also Indonesia, Australia, India. Should we be encouraging the countries in the Pacific Rim to take the leadership on this instead of putting our country out front?
Yeah, so I think that is the best policy right now because while it is important for us, it's not a priority. Risking American lives should not be the first sign of action in containing this. And besides, those countries already have a much bigger interest, and they'd be more than happy to take the lead. I think it was better just not really pull out a region, but simply give them more autonomy and simply continue our current trade relationship and just let them figure it out themselves.
Well, let me ask Jesse this because he mentioned the greed and the cheap foreign labor and the outsourcing, which is like Brandon said as well, that's the big story of the rise of China, that it was enabled by the United States, and we wouldn't have been here if it weren't for our desire to outsource. To what extent do you think we should be putting tariffs or otherwise trying to restrict trade with China?
I think we should definitely put tariffs on trade. It's going to be a way to encourage American companies to stay and possibly stop this greed. Say if it costs almost as much to have your company in China, their manufacturing based in China. If we could encourage them to stay in the U.S. by making it the cost difference not that much, maybe we could rebuild our industry and we could become the global trade power that China is trying to become.
Well, let me bring up the tariffs because Donald J. Trump, when he was in office, imposed tariffs in 2017. In 2019, he put a blanket ban on Huawei export controls, and now Joseph Biden has banned high-end semiconductor technology software. Now, these are promising signs, but this isn't anything like a full-on tariff on industrial goods. You think they haven't gone far enough?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to understand that there's a massive trade imbalance between us and China. We import far more from China than we export. So, in that regard, they have the upper hand on us. But there is such a thing as the International Trade Commission, and it does a pretty fair job. The International Trade Commission will, or the ITC, will stop a lot of these bad practices that China has in the past engaged in with trade with America. That imbalance heavily favors them, and we know that. But they're also engaged in other practices that harm our economy, such as the communist government will subsidize their domestic businesses so that they can then turn around and sell their goods here for cheaper than there. It's akin to, but not quite the same as dumping practices, which they also have engaged in. And it's the dumping practices that we targeted under Trump. I mean, he had specific tariffs. Don't get me wrong, but it's the tariffs that we use, and we don't use them often enough. We've not used them to the extent that we should have been using them up until his presidency. We use the tariffs to fight the unfair dumping practices, which basically means that, for our viewers who may not know what dumping is, basically, what dumping is it means that they can come up with a very similar product. They can sell it here. If we sell a product for $20 and they come out with the same thing and then they send it here, they will sell it for $10 here, but they're also selling it for $20 in their domestic market at home. But with the International Trade Commission, we have ways of fighting that, and we have done that. The U.S. government, however, has not done enough for consumers and for our domestic businesses until Trump did it. I'm not going to sit here and say that I am necessarily a Donald Trump fan. Did he do a lot of things that we would have long ago enacted or done? Yes. And in that regard, it was very positive.
Let me go back to Jesse on this, because you bring up a good point with Donald Trump. China was admitted to the WTO in 2000, 2001 under George W. Bush. To what extent do you think Republicans shoulder the blame for allowing our industry to be exported to China? This isn't necessarily a partisan accusation, but traditionally it's been Republicans that have been the party of big business. And during the Bush administration, I believe we lost something like 2 million manufacturing jobs to China.
Yes. Well, it's true that the Republicans, they prefer unrestricted capitalism. This is what has brought us to move all our stuff. Just like Burton, I'm not really a Trump guy. I mean, I voted for him, but what other choice do you have? Basically, let's restart. I fucked up. Say the question again.
Oh yeah. So China was admitted to the WTO in 2001 under the George W. Bush administration, and China was opened to the West under the Nixon administration. So in what way can we say Republicans were responsible for the rise of China if it weren't for Richard Nixon and George W. Bush? China would not be allowed to access the American market in the way they have now. So do they have to shoulder the blame as a party of big business? And to what extent should people blame the Republican Party for this?
Well, yes, it's true that the Republicans they do prefer unrestricted capitalism. They are the party of big business, and a lot of them themselves have moved their employees and their manufacturer base to China. and they do encourage this because people like to make money. What they didn't foresee is that this is going to cause a big issue, especially going into the future. Now we have a country that's potentially hostile that we are connected with. Even if we wanted to go to war with them, even if we had to go to war with them, it's going to hurt us very bad economically. It might not destroy us like it would destroy their economy, but it will. We
It'd be
need
unpleasant,
to,
definitely.
yeah, we definitely need to push our politicians, especially conservatives and Republicans, into not doing this anymore.
To change gears to not just be free trade anywhere in the world, basically.
Yes, we have to watch out for our own people as well as make money.
And Siri, if I could chime in on this, you brought up something very you brought up a good point. The fact that it was really Richard Nixon who got this ball rolling. There were practical reasons for all of this, which, you know, in Nixon's day probably looked like a really good geopolitical economic move. On the economic side, he knew that China was or already had and would continue to have a massive labor base. That's really the attraction. A huge labor base, huge industrial base because of it, but it's all built off of labor. The other thing is, and this is something that we're dealing with now, we really shot ourselves in the foot. You know, we may end up talking about the Russo-Sino relations, but
Yes, I was going to get to it.
back then, Russia was not just Russia, it was the Soviet Union. And both the Soviet Union and China obviously were communist. They had their differences, but if push came to shove, it was a very real danger that they could really join forces. And that would have created an almost impenetrable block for
They
us
had,
in Cold War.
that's right. They
But
had joined forces during the Korean War. And we saw the
absolutely,
effect that that had. Absolutely.
absolutely.
Mhm.
So
Let me
the-
let me pose another question, if I may. So in the 1970s, when Richard Nixon went to China, China was a very poor place, poorer than Haiti, impoverished, starving, and that's changed dramatically. So what you're saying is, as times change, our policy has to change too.
well, that's the art of the deal, you know, to kind of copy off Donald Trump. It was good for China. It was good for us. Geopolitically, strategically, it was very good for us. Which is why I don't quite knock Richard Nixon quite as hard, because the idea behind it is geopolitically, you know, strategically from a national security standpoint, it was absolutely a move to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And you know, getting around to the Russo-Ukrainian war, what have we done? We've finally driven them together. Our policy for the last 30 or 40, excuse me, at
I
this
will
point, 50 years.
I will get to it. I will get to it in a moment. It's a good thought. Hold it. Johan, I want to get back to you. Um, like Brandon was saying, China was a poor place. And with access to Western markets, they've grown tremendously. And like I was discussing with Jesse, we've seen tariffs on telecommunications, chips, software. We even saw attempts to ban the mobile app TikTok. These seem to me sometimes like they're more symbolic than anything else. What would a China tariff policy look like? Would it be focused on high tech stuff, or should it be basic industrial manufacturing?
Ironically, Trump had proposed the good policy back in 2019, conveniently before the COVID pandemic had come about. He proposed an idea of completely decoupling the United States from China, like not outright banning all business, but simply putting a tariff on everything, like that, like both in basic industrial goods, high end technology, anything China exports to the U.S., there'd be massive tariffs or outright bans on it. Because let's face it, no matter what China manufactures, it's at best either simply very poor quality to the point where it collapses easily, like those like buildings they construct in Africa, or in terms of advanced electronics, it's embedded with malware and spyware that connects directly back to China. As of now, any data that is recorded by a U.S. company is now in a Chinese database.
So
And so,
you think instead of focusing on high-tech software chips, there should just be a blanket tariff on anything?
yes, because that's really how our economy used to act. In fact, that used to be a Republican policy all the way up until Woodrow Wilson. When the US was in very much a similar situation to China, a poor country that was rapidly industrializing, we too had a powerful tariff policy against all foreign made goods. And that was what incentivized the mass development of our domestic industry. So in our current situation, we have to really return to our roots. Only by putting these tariffs in place can we re-incentivize the industrialization of the United States again.
Well, let me bring it back, and I'll ask Jesse this. Richard Nixon, a president who's perhaps been unfairly maligned over the years, would be rolling in his grave to see Russia and China pushed into something resembling a military and economic alliance. Jesse, we have the two largest powers in Asia, now seemingly joined at the hip. Should we be worried about this?
Yes, we should definitely be worried about this. The current administration, U.S. administration, is pushing them together. They're basically undoing everything that Reagan did. He started trade with them to pull them away from the Soviet Union and maybe give a boost to our economy and make a lot of people rich, which it did start to make China rich. But we continue our attitude towards China and Russia as well, including with this war that's going on in Ukraine. And I fear that one day they're going to be very united militarily if this keeps up, especially when Russia wins this war.
Well, on that note, let me bring that to Burton because neither country has explicitly declared that they're in a military alliance. They've not said, I will defend you if attacked, like NATO's Article 5 provision says. But we've heard statements from the Russians and Chinese, such as our partnership knows no limits. Both leaders, Vladimir V. Putin and Xi Jinping, have traveled to one another's capitals. They take photo ops. They stage long meetings, and trade has increased. So, what is the future of this partnership as far as it would affect America in the West?
Yeah, I think it's going to profoundly affect us in a negative way. But in my opinion, this was really all because of our bad foreign policy. It's because we have such a moralizing instinct after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was almost a second manifest destiny. We told the Russians that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east as long as they allowed us to go ahead and unify Germany. Well, we've expanded it over 1,000 miles to the east. And if you're China, if you're Xi Jinping, and you're sitting there watching this NATO expansion coming right up to Russia's border, it doesn't take much to figure out that you're next on the menu. And what are we seeing now? We're seeing the NATOization, if you will, of Japan. So we have driven them together at this point, I think, pretty inseparably. It would take a political earthquake, a revolution, really. The current leadership, the current government, the neocons in the American government, some earthquake would have to occur where they're out. And the new government, take RFK Jr., some of his stances, Fortress America, bringing our military back home, then we could possibly talk. But as long as we're engaging in this rabid expansionist type ideologies and this idea that we have to be that this world has to be unipolar in nature. We have to be the sole hegemon. I think it's irreversible too, because this month there is going to be a meeting on, I forget what country the meeting is taking place in, but a meeting is taking place where 81, 82 countries are going to join BRICS. And so many people have wondered for years now, why is it that Russia and China have been hoarding all the gold in the world? Well, now we know, because the dollar became almost said unpegged. It became untied from the gold standard in 1971, I think, thereabouts. China and Russia have now accumulated enough gold to where they could peg something like the yuan to it. And then all of a sudden, the way that we control the world ever since Bretton Woods, when all of the other economies after the Second World War were down and out, and everybody started trading through the dollar. And see, when they all transactions throughout the entire world have a dollar mark on them. And when they trade, export, import, it doesn't matter. Those dollars come through these tertiary banks. They come through America, and therefore they have to abide by our laws. They're going to get away from all that.
Extraterritoriality. Let me ask you this. We have some very large industrial powers in the Pacific Rim. Japan is a very large economy. South Korea is a very large economy. They probably don't want to become Chinese satellites. What should we tell them? Should we tell them you're on your own, or should our relationship be more of a mercantile one and say, we'll sell you all the weapons and ammo you want, but really you Asian countries should be leading some sort of front if you want to oppose China?
That for me, or
Oh, either of you could take it.
yeah, that would pretty much be what they would want, because their current opposition to China is not like some kind of pro-U.S. alliance. Like, they're not more in favor of supporting the current unipower system than China or Russia. Basically, everyone wants to build their own sphere of influence, and frankly, that might be the better scenario. If we, instead of building this sort of neoliberal trade system where we try to become dependent on each other, it more beneficial to build some kind of collaborative mercantile relationship where we trade on our own terms while allowing our own domestic industry and military to grow, and let them handle things in their own sphere, and us providing really tactical support, or not a tactical support, just like a weapon support, like selling them weapons, or if necessary, maybe they can hire PMCs based in the U.S. instead of
Well, let me ask you this, because there's a clause in the Japanese Constitution that prevents them from having offensive military weapons. Should we be encouraging Japan to ditch that, build aircraft carriers, develop nukes? I mean, how far does this go? Both South Korea and Japan have been under our nuclear umbrella, and we're committed to defend them. Should we be transitioning to letting these two countries, perhaps with India or the Philippines or Vietnam, to form their own bloc over there?
I believe so, because at this point, the one thing keeping, just like during the Cold War, the one thing keeping all out war from breaking out is the presence of nuclear weapons. But the thing is, so the logic goes that if more of those countries did develop their own nuclear capabilities, ironically, the chance of all out conflict breaking out would go down massively. Because, like, as we've seen with as many arguments you point out now, that the reason we shouldn't antagonize the Chinese or the Russians is because of our own mutual nuclear arsenals. Well, it leaves a question for other countries who don't possess them. Should they roll over against the nuclear power? Because if they fight back too much, they'll get nuked. I don't think anyone's going to really accept that. And
well,
so
let me take that. Let me take that great point to Brandon and Jesse here. American policy has always been non-proliferation. We've heard a lot of warnings about our confrontation with Russia, that we both have significant nuclear arsenals. Should we be backing off from that commitment in light of coming multipolarity? Should we be telling South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, hey, you should probably get nuclear weapons because the Chinese are only getting stronger? Or do we encourage them to rely on America for their military protection?
I definitely don't think that we should tell them to make their own nuclear weapons to defend themselves. First of all, I don't think China would, or any other country would just outright do a first strike on anybody, you know. But what they could do, a lot of those countries are very rich, some of the richest countries in the world, richer than some European countries, especially Japan, South Korea as well. They could create very powerful military. South Korea already has powerful military. They basically may or may not need us there. If Japan and Korea got together, it's going to be a very costly war for both North Korea and China. So,
Well, let me ask you this, and it's a great point because Taiwan has a per capita income basically on par with the United States. It's a very rich place, but their military is totally lackadaisical. Is that our fault for basically letting them think that they can rely on the big dog to protect them?
I don't think that there's going to be a war over Taiwan. If it came down to it, I think that China would simply blockade the place. Ultimately, there's an extremely low chance that we're going to send our navy in the event of a blockade over there to fight the Chinese navy, because the Chinese navy is not, it's not geared to project power across the world. What it is geared toward is protecting its domestic maritime interests. To that end, they have a very capable naval military power. Now, what you've got going on over in Ukraine right now, it's I hate to say it, but I think after the Ukraine war is won by Russia and NATO is essentially powerless because we don't have the troops, we don't have the amount of military equipment to fight Russia at this point, who is on a war footing. We don't have the logistics. It's going to become
So,
obvious
so
that
what you're
someone
saying
like
is
Japan
they're
or
going to
South
have to.
Korea, we can't run to their aid. And
They're you're
ultimately, we don't
you're
even have the army of 1991 anymore.
so you're saying out of pure necessity, they're going to have to become more self-reliant in defense.
I think once this conflict is over with, it's going to become sadly apparent that I I hesitate to use the term paper tiger because we're certainly not a paper tiger. We're the number one military in the world. But as far as projecting our power onto another great power through these proxies, it's never worked, and it's not working now.
Well, let me take this one to Guhan before we move on from the China issue. Taiwan, since the fall of the KMT as being kind of the sole political party, has kind of been run by liberal technocrats. Japan, although a more conservative place, also run by liberal technocrats. And South Korea, since the fall of their dictatorship. These places, well, South Korea accepted, don't spend a lot of money on the military. You think that's going to have to change out of necessity, or do we need to give them a shove in that direction?
It might actually just be out of necessity because there's one factor affecting the entire planet right now that many people, not everyone's avoiding, but it doesn't really come up as often as it should. Demographic collapse. Like both Europe, Russia, China, various Asian countries, the United States, and Canada, even certain Latin American nations, we're all going through some kind of demographic collapse.
And just a note for our listeners, South Korea has the worst demographic profile of any country ever recorded, with 0.8 children being born per woman last year, which is shocking.
Yeah, so in such demographic collapses, they alone will cause massive chaos economically, socially, politically, any kind of way. So in such a scenario, they would have you see these countries get more aggressive and probably start lashing out if only as a side effect of this chaos. And in such a hostile environment, it would make sense to become much more militaristic, especially since, in general, in response to demographic failures, the usual attitude is to become a more conservative and traditional society or sort of old family structures, if nothing else, just to reboost the population even faster. Like we
Well, let
saw
me
it in the Soviet
let
Union.
let me toss this one to Jesse though before we move on. South Korea, Japan, China all have terrible demographics. They're not having babies. Countries full of old people, do you think they'll get more or less aggressive? I'm inclined to think that they get less aggressive with fewer young men, but maybe that's a misplaced instinct.
I believe they would get less aggressive also. Without young men, who's going to fight? Every loss will be so costly that it's just not worth it, you know? And the way to counteract these demographic problems is to incentivize modern culture to have large families, you know, which it's kind of unaffordable to have large families. That's why a lot of people don't have it. We go through a lot of struggle. Myself, I'm the father of a decently sized family, 3 kids, going to go on to 4. So I understand how hard it is.
Well, that is a great point, which does segue into our next segment. Something people have been doing since the beginning of time, making babies, shouldn't be that complicated. The biology and the mechanics of it are well known. However, in modern times, some people have begun to get confused about the biology and the mechanics of human reproduction. Um, 2 months ago, the American, well, not even American anymore, the International Beer Company, Anheuser-Busch, which is a subsidiary of, I believe, A&B InBev, ran a limited marketing campaign where they sent promotional beer cans to some sort of Instagram influencer who identifies as transgender, someone named Dylan Mulvaney. And this sparked a really immediate backlash against Bud Light. The public, or at least the light beer drinking public, seemed incensed. You think this was just a case of them not knowing their customer, or is there something deeper going on?
It's definitely deeper because I went to business school. One of the very first things that you learn in business school is that a business exists for one thing and one thing only. That's to make money. A business doesn't have it doesn't have really it has very basic legal responsibilities to its employees, but probably not near as many responsibilities to its employees as it should. So it certainly doesn't have a responsibility to go out and partake in these culture wars and be a force for social justice. That's just not what businesses do.
But
However, they're
let me ask you this, and you and Jesse can both chime in on this. Why do you think they do it? I would think, who drinks Bud Light? People at football games, young men, mostly men, presumably. Why would they think this would fly?
Well, I think maybe it's either because the people who own those companies perhaps are HR departments or managers. A lot of them go to college and they probably learned a lot of that ideology from there. I think another thing is the people who are running things, their marketing, they have like a false interpretation that may make them money. They probably thought it was a good idea. They think that's how the American people are. They think that's how they think. They think we're all like that, maybe, or the majority at least. But what they didn't think of is I believe that the majority of Americans are more conservative than that. They don't believe that we should be marketing transgenders and posting them on billboards and putting them all over TV. We don't think that. And that's why they're going down. I used to drink Bud Light myself. I don't anymore.
Brandon, what do you think? Is it possible to be so out of touch that as a marketing director for a beer company, you could think that your target demographic would increase their beer purchases based on this campaign?
No, they absolutely knew what they were doing. I myself struggle to understand the connection, but I think, in my opinion, it's very clear that it was a calculated, not even a risk. They calculated taking a hit. I think they knew that they would take a hit, but they also knew it was highly likely that eventually those sales would rebound. It's corporate culture at this point. Once you become such a large player, like the NFL, when you become sort of a corporate icon, then the pressure legally must get to such a great point to where you feel that eventually you have to make this transition and align your corporate values, right, to where they made the bet that the culture is going ultimately.
Well, let me ask you this, Guhan. Bud Light's a large company. Well, Bud Light, their parent company is a huge company. Presumably, these are all people that know their target demographic pretty well. What kind of pressure could they be under, like Brandon was saying, to do something like this, even though they know they'll lose money? Does the money just not matter any?
No, there is money to be made. It all goes back to who the customer is. Now, we always know that customer is king. The average consumer is who gets you your profits. But these days, especially in our modern capitalist economy, there's another customer that especially big corporations look out for: investment banks. Usually, even if you take massive losses from consumer base, you can easily make up that and still make profits through investments and loans from these private banks. And right now, there's a stock that type of stock that's put out known as ESG, called Environmental Social Governance. Basically, it's a score that many of these large investment banks, such as BlackRock or Vanguard, put on companies to determine how much they promote these social justice policies. The idea being that if these companies promote these ideals, they can sort of make society better. And they reward them for doing this by giving them large investments. And such banks are able to provide such money because of pension funds. Many governments hand over pension money for them to manage and boost for their retirees. And so they essentially have a nearly unlimited supply of cash to work with. So they feel that they work with this and enforce these ideals on the corporations.
Now,
Taking the world.
I do recall a book written in the 1940s called Managerialism, the premise of which is that the managers of these huge pools of capital will ultimately become more powerful than the markets that created them. Do you think at this point that the capital, that's to say the loans, the equity investments, being listed on certain exchanges, or perhaps even being allowed to be invested in by large investment companies like Vanguard, Merrill Lynch, that's become a stronger market force than actually providing a product?
Yes, I believe at this point it has gone to that level, simply as part of it is our deindustrialization. Because with our industry moving to other countries, the biggest companies in the U.S. and the West in general are now these service sector groups. Particularly, sometimes they're quickly known as the vulture capitalists, a play on venture capitalists, because many of these investment banks look for these small companies to invest in, and essentially force their ideals upon, so because they're in such a desperate position. And the governments only encourage this because it's beneficial for them, since you think the economy becomes more ordered and easily controlled by the government, and also the poisonous relationship between them thanks to lobbying. And
Well,
so
let's talk about that for a moment as far as the managers and investors, because Jesse, we saw at Target, the big box retailer, rolling out a line of Pride clothes, I guess you could say, for the month of June, which had some pretty shocking content, kind of multi-gendered kind of stuff. A lot of parents saw this and flipped out. Target had to remove a lot of these items or move them to the back of the store. So this kind of goes back to the Bud Light question, but if the managers are running things and the customer doesn't really matter, what can we really do now?
Well, like what's been going on. People are boycotting this stuff. Supposedly, they were selling like things like tuck-friendly bikinis for children in young boys' size, basically, which is very bad. They don't care about the customer, first of all, obviously. I think that these people are out of touch. I think it's a mixture of, they think it's a good idea financially, trying to spread their customer base, basically. But they're also taking a hit for it as well. They know this, but the boycott, supposedly, it forced them to move these products to the back of the store. I guess that's the most that they did. From what I know, at least.
So as customers, you think we still do have some power. If enough people get angry enough and decide to stop shopping there, eventually they'll be forced to respond, either through losing money or their shareholders getting mad at them.
Definitely. I
Okay.
think that we have a lot of power.
That is encouraging, because sometimes as social conservatives, we can feel like we've been fighting a losing battle for 100 years, or maybe less than 100 years, but a long time. Brandon, boycott's partially successful in the Target case. Is this a good strategy long term, or are the managers basically going to do what they're going to do, and we're just going to have to suck it up?
Well, they don't really have a choice. You know, once you cross the Rubicon when it comes to this, there's really not any going back. But will Target suffer long term? They've hedged on the fact that they won't. They'll do some ad campaign, you know, maybe for the month of July, they throw some Americana in for 4th of July. Eventually, people have a very short memory. They fall into their old consumerist ways. They know that the damage is really minimal. But I think it's also very indicative, actually, of what Guhan put into words better than what I could. He said it better than I could. And I sort of held back from saying what I really wanted to say because it sounds conspiratorial, especially when it comes out of my mouth. As Guhan put it a lot better. But there is some other way that they will make money off of this, and Target is a great case study for it. How many children out there need, you know, this sort of apparel? Like zero. No parent. I mean, if the parent is crazy enough to do it, it has to be 0.1% of 0.1% of parents out there. They knew that they were not going to move that merchandise. It was a statement. So, yeah, I mean, to Guhan's point, I think he nailed it on the head. And I don't think that they will lose money. I mean, should they be boycotted? I mean, you know, consumers should definitely do what they have to do to make their point. And going to, just very briefly back to Bud Light, I think that they've been shocked. Because not only has the sales of Bud Light continued to be depressed, but all of their other brands that people know are associated with Bud Light, like Budweiser, they have also saw depressed sales. I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's a culture war, and it's really not good for our society. But they engender that.
Before I get back to Guhan, let me go to Jesse, because on the legal front, in the year 2020, a supposedly conservative Supreme Court said that firing or discriminating against employees based on sexual orientation qualified as sex discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. We saw a significant majority of Americans opposed to gay marriage. In 2008, California voted to ban it in their constitution. In a year that was a wave year for Barack Obama. But as soon as the Supreme Court decided that the authors of the 14th Amendment had meant to legalize gay marriage in 1868, American attitudes started to change. In what sense is this a permanent ratchet? If they simply declare that this is a constitutional right, we've seen Americans' attitudes become overall favorable towards gay marriage. Is there a chance to come back to the socially conservative position from this?
Well, this is going to be an uphill battle. Just because you oppose gay marriage doesn't mean that you hate gay people or anything. I mean, I don't really hate anybody. I don't hate a particular group of people. First of all, marriage is a institution of religion, basically. And there's not a single major religion that thinks gay people should be married together. A man and a man can't get married, and a woman shouldn't get married. I think this is increasing, and Americans may in the future even be more friendly to gay marriage and such things, including things that probably include children in the future. I think we have to constantly fight, and we have to try to get our voices out and stand up.
Let me ask you this, because what Brandon and you brought up was that this clothing line was targeted towards children who think they're a different gender. Is the idea that children have some sort of determination or agency about their sexual expression? And Guhan, feel free to chime in on this as well, that children have agency, that children have some sort of mature knowledge about their sexual expression. Is that a slippery slope to something far worse?
I think it's something that parents should decide for their children. When you want your child to know about that, which when they're getting into their teenage years and start having certain feelings, you got to let them know about stuff like that. But children, prepubescent children definitely shouldn't learn anything like that. My children who are young, they have no idea what that stuff is. They shouldn't. When they reach an age where it becomes natural to start thinking about stuff like that, that's when you have to teach them. But parents should take charge of that themselves. And I don't think that the media or anything should teach them things about sex that aren't true, especially something that's coming from such a tiny percent of the population, such as transgenderism and things like that.
I mean,
well, let me ask you this. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brandon.
No, I just wanted to say something really quickly to summarize, to put it flatly. Why are you trying to push something that is explicitly sexual in nature on someone who is not yet a sexual being? There's no logic that you can wrap your mind around that's going to explain that.
Well, let me ask Guhan this, because perhaps there is a dark logic to it. If children have a actual mature level of knowledge about what their gender expression should be, are the advocates of this kind of stuff implying that children are sexual beings with all that entails? What do you think?
Yeah, this definitely could go down a slippery slope, because simply that, look, we were all kids at one point. I think looking back, we can definitely say we were not as smart or responsible enough as we are when we became adults. That's the reason why we have age limits on certain video games and media, even getting driver's license and applying for, or even just drinking alcohol, going back to Bud Light. Like, simply our brains haven't developed enough to make these kind of decisions. You can't. I'm pretty sure that when we were 5 years old, some of us at some point said, "I want to turn into an airplane," or "I think I'm going to fight dragons." Like, sure, that makes sense to our childlike minds, but that's not realistic. So should that same person really decide that they're suddenly going to change genders, or that they're who they're attracted to? Like, no. Like, that's the decision, once again, like Jesse said. The parents have to be the ones to teach their child. Even then, they have to fully make a decision when they're fully become adults and can fully understand concepts and assume responsibility. This idea of putting it on the children is a concerning ideal, because if they can consent to one thing, then they can consent to other things as well.
And that could go in a dark direction, obviously. And let me put this back to the panel for the last few minutes of our show. What are some first steps we could do, that our government could do, to start pushing back against this idea?
Well, I think we cannot trust the government and the education system because it's obviously slowly drifted into teaching them that they could change genders and things like that. Kids are hearing about this stuff much earlier than they should, and they start thinking it's cool. They start thinking that's brave, especially if our schools and our government is telling them that that's brave. We have our most powerful person in the country, Biden, telling people that it's brave. Kids are going to see this and think it's cool, and some kids are confused about it, especially if their parents aren't defending them and telling them what's correct. If I think it's our responsibility to do this. If we don't have true conservatives in power. We have these old school conservatives and these liberal Democrats and basically socialists in power. We have to push our politicians into making this better, which I think is slowly happening on the state level. In certain states, they're banning certain things such as drag shows, and a lot of people are getting appalled.
We've got to
So we need to
stiffen their
continue.
spine basically by letting them know, hey, we're not okay with this. This is a drop dead issue like abortion was for us, that if you're not on our side, we're not going to vote for you, period, no matter what.
Yes, definitely. That's probably the main thing that we have to do.
Well, Brandon, our resident Floridian, Joseph R. Biden came out and called the recent ban in Florida against, I guess you could say, surgical mutilation of children, cruel, abusive, a violation of human rights. You wouldn't have heard this language from Barack Obama, who ran opposing gay marriage. It seems like the slope is getting awfully slippery. What do you think we can do?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. He ran opposing gay marriage as a candidate. He opposed gay marriage to more or lesser extent, but he ended up lighting up the White House in rainbow colors. So, I mean, I think there's two levels to this. There's the electoral level, and then you have to put the right people in office. Obviously, that's the obvious thing. But at the end of the day, these laws that get passed, like Texas, Florida, way back when North Carolina voted overwhelmingly, like 63%, against gay marriage. It just gets reinterpreted by the courts. The main
Well,
thing, it all ties back, if I could just finish this one thing,
sure.
it all ties back into consumerism. You have your one vote as it pertains to president, as it pertains to your senator, but your real vote is this right here. Because they weaponize especially as Americans, our consumerist tendencies against us and our consumerist habits to essentially control us and control the agenda and the culture of America. You see that with Target. You see that with Bud Light. It's a cabal. And until we take ownership of our own actions and our own consumerist mentalities, then it will never change.
Well, let me ask you this, because in Sweden, in Denmark, and the United Kingdom, we've recently seen governments that we normally think of as being to the left of ours in the United States banning any of this hormones and surgery for children. Is there a chance to change minds in the Democratic Party about this?
Probably not, because the Democratic Party is captured by Big Pharma. Then they were captured by Big Pharma through Barack Obama, essentially through a deal, when we were passing Obamacare. Basically, Big Pharma got to keep their and all of their tertiary affiliates, all of those businesses. They got to get their cake and eat it too, while Obama just got his cake. Obama got the law, but Big Pharma and all of those tertiary industries that benefit from this, they got to charge top rate right? Because unlike Canada, they didn't have to negotiate prices, and they
So
had they had really no competition from the government.
now these countries in Europe I mentioned obviously have national health care. The only customer for prescription drugs is the government, so you feel like they're not under the same pressures.
No, because they're able to bargain for better prices like Canada is. So they're more regulated by the government. I mean, if you were to go to Germany, let's just say, or France, you would see the exact same product sold on their shelf. But if you were to look closely at the ingredients, you would notice key chemicals. Well, it's just a soda. Let's take a soda. You'll see the same name brand on our shelf as over in Germany. But if you flip it around and you look what's in it, you'll notice that there's one or two usual chemicals that are missing. Sorry, the dog's barking. But there's one or two missing, and that's because their government said this is not good for human beings to consume. We don't have those same protections here in America.
Let me bring this back to Guhan to close it out. Brandon made a good point about regulatory capture, lobbying. In what sense can we say that this whole thing is I guess you could say a scheme to get permanent customers for pharmaceutical drugs? Can we really lay this on industry, or are these kind of crazes begun somewhere else?
Yeah, it is a good question because it's almost like a chicken and the egg scenario. We know both sides are benefiting, the political, social side and the corporate side. Where to really begin? I have to say, it had to begin with the social side in the first place because a lot, like we talked about before, a lot of these what do you call that? Human resources, these managerial people, they're the ones who first pushed these ideas and especially in academia, they made all these ideas popular amongst the people in the first place. And the companies recognize this, as we said before, they put their bets on this trend rising and decide just to cash in on it. Because ultimately, when it comes to economics, the simple term, it's the study of how people spend their money. And no matter how much influences there are, ultimately we decide who we give our dollars to. So if you, by controlling the culture and narrative in a country, you could in theory control how they spend their money.
Ah,
So
this is a great point. And it's a nasty feedback loop, but ultimately we are still conscious. We can control where we spend our money. Gentlemen, any parting words before the end of show one?
yeah, I will say this, that what I just said, how controlling the culture controls our money, that does also reveal how we can fight back against this trend. If people could have been convinced to support these progressive ideals and spend their money on it, then they too can also be convinced to go away back to more traditional ideals and to just spend their money to support more traditional cultural values. So ultimately, that's the key. We have to realign the culture back towards tradition if we want to really fight against this.
Brandon, any parting words?
I think just practical ones. Not to steal any of your thunder, Siri, but for those who are tuning in and watching us for the first time, we're the Conservatives for Tradition and an Integral Nation. You can visit us, visit our website, and learn more about us at integralnation.us, not .com. We plan to be doing these sort of roundtable discussions roughly every 2 weeks. I think we've agreed upon. We will probably be rotating. Moderators series done a great job this time, really great. But always remember to like and subscribe to our stuff. I mean, it helps us beat the YouTube algorithm, and we need all the help that we can get. So if you like what you hear, visit our website, check us out, read our Substack, and we very much appreciate your support.
And I'm sure, Jesse, you can tell us a few things about our YouTube channel.
Yeah, definitely. You guys know what we stand for. We're basically the new conservative group. Our politicians are seeming to fail us. So if you want to stand up for what you believe, along with other young men and women, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch all of our stuff.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. You can find us there at Integral Nation Institute, where we try to post our hot take of the day if we can. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will be with you every month to cover the big stories. Conservatives for Tradition and the Integral Nation Institute. We will see you next time.